Hey everybody. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little lecture here about chapter 47.2 of the OpenStax Biology 2E textbook. And this is called The Importance of Biodiversity to Humans. Okay. Okay, so as in my other lectures, I'm going to ask you a series of questions that hit upon, I think, some of the key points of this chapter section. And when I've asked the question, you'll see the multiple choice options on the screen. If you could just pause the screencast and try to answer the question, and then you can see how you did. I'll discuss the answers. Okay. So for this first slide here, as I write, the textbook makes a statement that from the perspective of evolution and ecology, the loss of a particular individual species is unimportant. Okay. So I want to stop there and just say that's a pretty striking statement. From the perspective of evolution and ecology, the loss of a particular individual species is unimportant. Okay, so it shouldn't make a big ecological difference. Ecosystems should still be able to function okay. Shouldn't make a big difference to the course of evolution on our planets either. However, they did give an exception. So this is maybe a difficult statement, like for me at least, I don't like that. But the book did mention an exception to this. So a certain kind of species that actually could make a big difference if lost, an individual species. And so which of these four choices was that type of species? Okay, so the answer to this question is keystone species. So keystone species, so the keystone of in architecture, I don't know if you've seen stone arches, but if you've seen a stone arch, they're going to look sort of like these big stones making up the arch. They're going to look sort of like this. And the keystone is the stone at the very top of the arch. Oops, oh no, this is not a very good picture. Very top of the arch. And it has this unusual shape like this. And that stone, if it's not present, the entire arch will fall apart. It will no longer have structural integrity. And that's the concept of a keystone species. If you lose this one species from an ecosystem, it's going to have a huge impact on the integrity of the ecosystem as a whole. It's going to have large impacts on other species and the functioning of the whole ecosystem. So an example of this, so this is one kind of species that we don't want to lose even one. An example of this is the sea otter in the ocean, the Pacific Ocean off the northwest, or northwest of the U.S. And the species is the sea otter. Why are these guys so important? So there was a while where sea otters, I believe, were hunted to very, very low numbers in that area, and it did cause very major ecosystems changes. And these are the places they inhabit are these kelp forests. So this is a kind of seaweed. And these kelp forests host a huge amount of life. They're very productive ecosystems. And what happened was that when the sea otters were overhunted, so they were no longer present in very large numbers, sea urchins began to take over and eat up all the kelp. And so kelp was totally disappearing, which meant there was no food for the mussels, there was no food for the abalones, and we had huge changes in all these different species, and the whole ecosystems were really degraded. Fortunately, sea otters have made a fairly good comeback in a lot of places, and the ecosystems are recovering somewhat. But that's a really good example of a type of species that matters a lot to ecology. Okay. Next slide. Oops. Okay. All right. So this is another question that kind of comes out as sort of the introductory material to this chapter section. We're talking about the effect of technology on humans' relationship with biodiversity and with nature in general. And so my question is, technology has had all of the following effects on humanity except for what? So technology has all of these effects except what? And the answer is that it has not eliminated our dependence upon natural ecosystems. Okay. Maybe without reading the textbook, you could guess that one. Okay, so whereas it is true that it has made it harder for us to recognize our dependence on natural ecosystems because we don't live out there in the elements, we aren't necessarily growing our own food or gathering or hunting it ourselves. So it's hard to recognize our dependence, but we are certainly still highly, highly indispensably connected and dependent upon natural ecosystems. Yes, certainly technology has helped with many debilitating health conditions, and it has smoothed out the extremes of our existence. Like, for instance, we don't have to be outside in the middle of a hurricane anymore. And we can know that those hurricanes are coming and we can prepare for them. So it has smoothed out the extremes of our existence, but it hasn't eliminated our dependence upon natural ecosystems. Okay. There we go. Okay. All right. So next, the chapter talked about the importance of agricultural diversity. Okay. And so one specific example of this is that I'm not sure if the section was agricultural diversity. It might have been, I can't even remember what the section was titled. But anyway, the point is that they talked about how many medicines are made from natural compounds, or have been made or identified and discovered from living organisms. The ultimate source of many medicines that we've used. And so, and a lot of these medicines have specifically come from compounds produced by plants to protect themselves. So what is the name of these compounds that plants use to protect themselves? Okay, the answer is plant secondary compounds. Plant secondary compounds. I think, don't quote me on this, but I think that they're called this because the functions that these compounds serve are of sort of secondary importance to the plant, meaning that they're not compounds that they need for photosynthesis, which would be like such a critical function of the plant that we would consider it a primary function. Secondary compounds, aren't involved in those processes, but they serve other purposes. And here's some examples in this picture. So, for instance, the secondary compounds might protect against herbivores, make the plant not taste good, so that it doesn't get eaten as much. Might help to defend against the attack of microorganisms, like fungus that might attack the leaves or something. They might protect them from excess sunlight, sort of like the melanin in our skin, or it might help them with competition with other plants. So those are some of the functions that the plants are producing these secondary compounds for, but it turns out some of them are very valuable and can be used for medical purposes for humans as well. Okay. All right. So if we do this, if we get medicines from plant secondary compounds and also from other microorganisms such as bacteria and fungus, we get medicines from them as well. What proportion of pharmaceutical, medical drug research and development funds go into natural compounds that we find in organisms? So what proportion of pharmaceutical research and development goes into natural compounds? How important is this to drug development? Okay. So the answer turns out is 35%. So over 1/3 of all our medical research for drugs is funneled into natural compounds. So it's really, really important for medicine. No, this screen's not very responsive today. Come in. Why are we not going to? Oh, yeah. Okay, here we go. Okay. All right, so now we're getting to the agricultural section. So biodiversity is also really important for agriculture. And specifically, the chapter talked a bunch about food security. So meaning like how safe and reliable our food system is and our food production. And so all of the following things are directly increase food security except for one of them. So all these following things directly increase food security except what? Okay. So the answer is that combating crop pests with natural predators, while it may be a really good thing and it might help support diversity of especially insects that live in crop fields, that doesn't directly increase our food security. However, these other things do. So maintaining seed banks, so this is so that we can maintain a lot of varieties of different crops and save those seeds so that we don't lose them in the future. If we grow diverse varieties of crop plants, then we have, if it turns out one variety gets struck by a bad disease and gets wiped out in a particular year, we still have other varieties that are resistant to that disease. And also preserving the wild relatives of crop plants is also really important too, because that'll help us develop new crop varieties in the future that might be resistant to different conditions that we might encounter in the future. Okay. Oh, hold on. Okay. Okay, so the chapter also talks a little bit about ecosystem services as a benefit that humans get from biodiversity. So ecosystem services are simply benefits that humans receive from healthy and intact ecosystems. So benefits that humans receive from healthy and intact ecosystems. So all of these following are examples of ecosystem services, except what? Ha! This is a trick question. So actually, in fact, these are all very important ecosystem services. Every single one of these: pollination, essential for agriculture; soil fertility, also essential for agriculture; pest control, essential for agriculture and just for having happy lives; and flood control, maybe not so important to agriculture, but that's a very, critically important thing that wetlands specifically can provide. So these are ecosystems on the edges of oceans and the edges of other water bodies that are kind of half in the water and half out. And basically, these ecosystems act as big sponges when there are high water events, when there's huge torrential rains and we get really high waters. They kind of suck up the water and prevent flooding in the surrounding areas. And so that is a really important ecosystem service. Places like New York City, where in fact 1/3 of the land area of New York City was once wetland, and it has been covered over with fill soils and developed. So we lost a huge number of wetlands, and these are all areas that would historically have received water into them, and it would have been naturally dealt with by the wetlands. Now they're all developed; they're impervious surfaces, and so this is just puts New York City and many other cities are similar at much greater threat of flooding than it would otherwise be if we still had those wetlands surrounding the city. Okay. Next one. And then here we go. Okay. Then the chapter 2 also talked about wild food sources, and the primary one of these being fish. Now, more and more humans conduct aquaculture to produce fish for human consumption, so in other words, fish farming. However, still, across the world, many people depend on wild populations of fish and other aquatic animals and plants as a primary source of food, as a primary source of protein. So how many of Earth's people depend primarily on aquatic, water-based resources for animal protein? How many people? So the answer is 1 billion. 1 billion. So that's, I think we have we're around about 9 billion people on Earth now. So 1 in 9 people, their primary source of protein comes from fish and things like that, from oceans. So the health and the diversity of those species is really important as a source of food. Okay. And I wanted to explain this picture. So, let me get my pen again. So one of the things that we're seeing, because unfortunately, we are overfishing most of the fisheries in the world, we are seeing that fish are becoming smaller and smaller. And there's a couple of reasons for this. One is that, so here's, the 1930s. This was the size at maturation of these these are Northeast Arctic cod, I believe. Northeast Arctic cod. And 1970s, they'd gotten smaller, 3 centimeters smaller on average. In the 2000s, down to 73 centimeters long from 85. So that's 12 centimeters shorter. That's a whole foot. No, sorry, that's inches. 12 centimeters away. So it's not a foot, but it's considerably shorter. And there's a couple reasons for the smaller size. One is that we're catching the big ones, so it's just they aren't there. But also, it turns out that evolution has happened in some of these populations of fish. So the smaller fish, they have designed the nets so that the smaller fish can get away. And because those smaller fish are getting away, they're the ones who have the chance to reproduce. And so they're going to pass their genes on to the next generation. So this is a good example of natural selection. And so it turns out there's been a selective pressure, a pressure by natural selection for these fish to mature at a smaller size. So grow to a smaller size at maturity when they're able to reproduce, and then to reproduce earlier so that they don't get caught before they reproduce. And so they actually have evolved to become smaller. So that's not really good for us, certainly if we want to eat food, because the fish are smaller. But it also indicates that we're putting a lot of pressure on our fisheries. That is not good for them, most likely. Okay. All right, last slide. This is the last slide. Okay, so the chapter ends up just briefly discussing a couple more ways that biodiversity is important to humans. Okay. Just a couple more ways, and they don't discuss them at length. I feel like actually they don't really give them enough service, but what are some of the other, why else might biodiversity be important to humans? Besides the things we mentioned above in terms of ecosystem services and agriculture and medicine and wild food populations, why else might biodiversity be important? Okay, so the answer, of course, is D, both A and B. So it turns out they don't really give this a name, but they talk a little bit about something that is called biophilia. This is a hypothesized characteristic of humans. It was hypothesized by E.O. Wilson, really famous biologist. So E.O. Wilson hypothesized that humans have an genetically wired attraction to nature, a desire to be around nature, and it's good for us on sort of a cellular and a health level to be around nature because we've evolved in natural settings for thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. And so when you pull us out of nature and put us into very technological environments, it's actually very stressful upon us in a psychological way because we don't have these other creatures and these natural settings around us that help us feel like we're at home and we're safe and all these good things. So biodiversity improves our mental health, definitely. The other point that they made was that, okay, they just spent a whole chapter talking about why biodiversity is important to humans, but isn't there actually, don't these other creatures have a right to exist, and isn't there an impetus on us to help preserve them just because they are other creatures and they exist? That seems to be a natural thing that, if there is, why should we have more right to exist and to survive than any other species? So that is also another reason, obviously, to preserve biodiversity, because we have a moral obligation to do so. Okay, that's all I have for you now. Oh, by the way, this is a piece of art by an artist named Christopher Marley. He made a whole collection of art pieces, and the name of the collection was Biophilia. And so this is one of the pieces in that I thought was quite nice. And he actually makes art out of preserved specimens. So these are all real insects, I think probably pinned to something, which is a little weird, but certainly beautiful and amazing. Okay. All right. Thanks, everybody. See you later.